Don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these heterodox conversations for complexity. Hello again, and thanks for tuning in. Just a couple notes that I'd like to make. As a reminder, our website is wegrowteachers.com, and although we have changed names from Teach Thought PD to Thought Stretchers Education, all of our services like project-based learning, inquiry, differentiated instruction, and much more are all available there as professional development and learning opportunities. If you're looking to grow your school, please visit us there or email me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org. We're also getting closer to the official launch of our Thought Stretchers community. If you're interested, we do have a landing page there, which is at wegrowteachers.com/thoughtstretchers. There we hope to host and give a space for K-12 stakeholders to think more deeply about some of the more contentious issues, from pedagogy to culture war issues. And again, wegrowteachers.com/thoughtstretchers. You can sign up for the email list, which will let you know when we officially launch. So we're very excited about that, and hopefully that will happen very soon. In this episode, I spoke with Nick Dirks, who is the president and CEO of the New York Academy of Sciences. They're an organization that promotes science-based solutions to world challenges, including pandemics and global warming. And Nick has a really interesting backstory and history of organizations and institutions with whom he has worked. Among the things we talked about were the importance of free speech and free expression, and his experience many decades ago working at Berkeley, and how that dynamic has changed dramatically since his time at Berkeley, especially in some of those organizations that were hallmarks of free speech and free expression. So that transformation to a more illiberal approach and thinking about how that happened and some of the roots and origins of that. We talked about things like a sphere of consensus and how we come to truth and what kinds of opinions and viewpoints and ideas should we be entertaining. And then ended the conversation more talking about the reputation of science and the science community and public health and some of the dynamics at play there. We also talked about their junior academy and some of the resources and programs that they have available for K-12 educators that are certainly worth checking out. The website is nyas.org, and we'll put that in the show notes, of course. And as always, I hope this conversation is helpful. And without further ado, here's Nick. All right, I am here with Nick Dirks, and Nick is going to introduce himself in a moment. We're going to talk about who knows what exactly, but lots of things about the future and thinking about higher education and some bias pieces and some thinking about authority and expertise and whether or not we can trust folks in the science realm and those kinds of issues. But without further ado, Nick, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, tell our audience who you are and what you do, and we'll go from there.
Thanks, Drew. It's great to be here in conversation with you. So I'm Nick Dirks. I'm currently the president and CEO of the New York Academy of Sciences. It's a old and venerable institution that was established in New York in 1817, and it's still going strong 206 years later. And we do a lot of things, which I'll talk about, during our conversation. Before I came to the Academy, I was chancellor of the University of California at Berkeley, and where I was also a professor of history and anthropology. And before that, I've taught and had different administrative roles at Columbia University in New York, at the University of Michigan, and at Caltech. So I've spent most of my life in the university world, and starting at Columbia, where I was the dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, I've begun to look at the university more broadly, both in terms of all the disciplines it encompasses, but also, the kinds of issues that confront higher education in America today, both in private and in public institutions. So that's who I am, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah. Well, you said a bad word there. Folks can't see, but I'm wearing a Michigan State pullover, which is my alma mater, and you said a bad word, the school down the road, but I'll forgive you. You've moved on and to some much better institutions. Interesting list of institutions where you have worked, and a lot of those are as I'm sure you're well aware, and folks might be well aware of, being, in the sort of news in the culture wars kinds of things, Columbia Teachers College, you said UC Berkeley, some of the things that are going on there. So, one of the pieces, everything that we talk about in professional development work that we do is through the lens of inquiry, and really trying to rely on and strengthen sort of those skills and traits and attributes that K-12 learners then hopefully would carry into university, non-university adult roles. I guess maybe a starting question is, when you think about the sort of culture or state of higher education, and if you want to speak outside of higher education, your observations, inquiry, free speech, free expression, where are we in your perception in that context?
Yeah, well, it's a very interesting and turbulent time, really, on not just college campuses, but I think in all educational institutions, in which it used to be the case, I think, that there was general agreement across different kinds of political positions and perspectives and backgrounds that, the purpose of education was to develop a kind of critical approach to everything one learned, that to do that best, one would have to learn how to accept, understand to the extent that one can, and respectively engage with other kinds of positions, with people who might have positions that you might consider to be even anathema, but which nevertheless is part of the exchange that goes on in an educational context. And you're absolutely right that places like Columbia and UC Berkeley have been in the news of late, but UC Berkeley was the scene as well some 60 odd years ago of the free speech movement, which was the first real eruption on a college campus in post-war America, advocating for the fact that campuses should be free speech zones. Because prior to 1964, the idea that many administrators had was that the way to have neutrality of a political kind on a university campus was to keep political speech off campus. And that actually is what precipitated the 1964 free speech movement at Berkeley. There were some activists who had just returned from Mississippi during Freedom Summer in 1964 who wanted to recruit students to join the civil rights movement. And they put up desks on what they thought was Berkeley city property, but it turned out to belong to the university, and the university asked them to move. And that's what led to the conflict. And in those days, free speech was being advocated for in large part by people on the side of greater participation in civil rights movements, growing concern about the war in Vietnam. Some of the kinds of free speech debates that took place were over the visits of speakers like Stokely Carmichael, who was a civil rights activist on the one side, but even Robert F. Kennedy on the other. So that was the kind of scene then. Now you flash, go forward to the present, 60 years later, and most of the controversies are not about speakers on the left; they're about speakers on the right, and it's the left that is upset about who's coming. But those disputes, and I've been part of quite a number of them, and I can speak about them if you'd like, are in some sense just the tip of the iceberg, because the real issue is what goes on in the classroom, what goes on in the learning process, what goes on for students, and this is true both of students in middle school and high school, as well as students in college, and for that matter in graduate school. What is the appetite for really trying to understand other perspectives, other ideas, other ways of thinking about the world? And, again, to go back to my own academic background as an anthropologist who's spent a lot of my time working on different kinds of cultural understandings of the world, I've always thought the way you really come to understand yourself is through engaging with the other. And that, in fact, one learns a great deal from from those kinds of experiences and from those efforts to really study and understand how other people kind of think about the world and the like. And now, we too often live in bubbles of just people who live often online to a very large extent, but have very, very many of the same views and the like. So it's a real shift, in other words, from where I remember these kinds of debates beginning. There's a lot of work I think we need to do to reestablish not only a tolerance for it, but actually a serious interest in multiple perspectives, and I certainly believe that even today, with the huge amount of attention being focused on the Middle East, it's probably a more important thing than ever that we figure out how to talk to people we don't agree with.
Yeah, well, you mentioned sort of middle school, high school. Of course, that's a lot of the work that we do, and we work preschool and university and non-academic or non-traditional academic, nursing schools, all kinds of settings. And we really do focus on inquiry. I'm curious, I mean, you talked about this sort of historical shift, and it really is sort of stunning to see a place like UC Berkeley, which has such a rich history, as you mentioned, of really advocating for free speech. It was sort of an epicenter of that. And now seeing a sort of weird flip to the idea that speech is violence, and shouting down speakers, and heckler's veto, and all of these kinds of things, and really looking to identify what is hate speech and say we're gonna repress this because those are bad ideas, which is sort of not sort of, it's really in direct tension with a university mission of finding truth, right? Is hearing all of the different viewpoints. I have some theories about how this may have originated, and I've certainly, some of them not unique and something that I've come up with, but I do have a theory about how the K-12 world has worked. But I'm curious what you have seen, or what your perception is of how we got to where we are now.
So I think it's been 60 years is a long time, and there are lots of different shifts that have taken place, and and one can give different kinds of historical accounts. But I think when you look at the college campus, things really began to change pretty dramatically in the years after the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. In places like New York and Berkeley, Oakland, there were big reactions to the recession, led to participation on the part of some people in the Occupy movement, and there was a sense at that point that things had begun to go out of whack in the U.S., and there was growing inequality, et cetera, et cetera. And I think there were a lot of people who were deeply concerned about what they saw as a failure of our economic system. But it's hard to see that as the causal factor, except as far as the fact, and this is, I'm actually going on the basis of work being done by somebody you've talked to in a previous podcast, Jonathan Haidt from NYU, who has shown that the kinds of things that we're talking about, the kinds of shouting down, the kind of emphasis on speech only as violence and not as the expression of different kinds of points of view, begins to be reflected on college campuses, in particular around 2012, 2013. So, 10 years ago. And some of that might have drawn from the aftermath of the recession. Some of it might have drawn from other things that happened around reactions to 9/11. But, it feels like a different world because, university has always been a place that, you have a lot of different voices being raised. Sometimes they're raised loudly, and, to some extent that's great, right, as long as you let different voices be heard. And as, many people have said, and I said when I was chancellor at Berkeley, the best antidote to speech you don't like is more speech. And that's how you deal with it. But but what Jonathan argues, of course, is that moment of transition or change correlates perhaps most of all with social media.
Yeah.
And he's made very interesting arguments about how the kind of creation of bubbles of self-affirmation that are constantly part of a reinforcing feedback mechanism on social media platforms is what drives really the view that you can only talk to people you agree with, or you can only feel aggrieved by people who are in your own circle of or bubble of thought. Again, I think there's something to that, but it sure is a different world.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it changed really quickly. And I'll just give you one quick story. In 2014, we celebrated at Berkeley the 50th anniversary of the free speech movement. I heard a lot of people concerned about the fact the administration was not coming out strongly enough in favor of free speech. Of course, we celebrated free speech. We celebrated the anniversary of this movement, but we also sent out a message calling for some kind of civility on campus, by which I meant it would be good for people to be able to engage each other civilly, to respect other points of view, and that even as we exercise free speech, it would be good if that free speech were as open as possible to opposing points of view. So I got a lot of criticism for that. That's 2014. 2016 or 2017, 3 years later, the young Republicans at Berkeley invited Milo Yiannopoulos to come speak on campus, and there was a huge reaction to that. He was doing a kind of college tour at the time, and there had been demonstrations and protests at every place from University of Washington, University of California, Davis, University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. There were some very big incidents that took place. And
for those folks who aren't familiar with Milo Yiannopoulos, because he's actually been out of the public eye a little bit more in recent years, but he was a very right-wing agitator. I don't know if there's a better way to describe him, but the pushback was that he was just sort of very far alt-right and just an agitator of fascism and Nazism, or whatever pejorative you wanted to, and much of it well deserved, and I think purposely on his part. So folks, you can look up Milo Yiannopoulos if you're not familiar with him. So sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Drew. It's true that he's kind of faded away, and but in 2017 he was like in the news a lot, and he was a provocateur,
right.
And there's no doubt that he was seeking attention for himself. But on the other hand, the point is that the faculty and many students came to me and said, you have to cancel this because it's going to cause harm to me if he comes to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And so within 2-3 years, there'd been a kind of shift that I saw myself between those who didn't want to have any modification, any mitigation of commitment to free speech, and those who thought free speech all of a sudden was very dangerous and could cause actual harm.
Mm-hmm.
So there you have it. But it's just gotten more intense, I think, since 2017.
Well, what do you make of the theory that, and I'm reading Yascha Mounk's Identity Trap book right now, and I've heard him talk enough about it that I'm only a couple chapters in, but he's really sort of crystallizing the argument that I've heard in other places, different versions of it, but that this largely a lot of this comes from the sort of Foucault, postmodernism, and these sort of philosophical thinkers that are then we see the downstream effect into Derek Bell and intersectionality and critical theory, critical gender theory, critical race theory, and all of the sort of tendrils that sort of shoot off of that. Does that resonate with you, or do you see a different sort of origin story?
Yeah, interesting. I haven't read Yascha's book yet, so I can't speak about it per se. But but if that's his argument, I actually have a different perspective, because I think you can find all kinds of genealogies for what has become an interest on the part of many people to see issues of race, issues around gender, issues around sexuality, issues around ethnicity and the like,
Mm-hmm.
as really more important than anything else. But the other way of looking at it is basically since I'm sorry to do this. I'm going to go back again. I'm partly a historian, so forgive me. But I go back to 1962,
Mm-hmm.
again at Berkeley. This time, a book that was written by a faculty member there by the name of Thomas Kuhn, who wrote a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and it actually became one of the best-selling books of the next decade, because he was a scientist by original training, and then he wrote a book basically that argued that there were different paradigms that governed the way in which science was conducted in a Newtonian world, or in a world of Galileo and Copernicus, or in the world of Einstein, etc. So he basically said that the way even scientists view the world changes radically when certain kinds of fundamental ideas change and develop, and you get E equals mc squared, and that changes the way we think about the world. All of a sudden there's uncertainty in the uncertainty principle of Heisenberg, or all of a sudden there's what has now been part of the development of quantum mechanics and is being used to develop a whole new generation of computation in quantum computing, basically saying that you cannot track the position of a particle at the same time that you can understand its momentum. You cannot see it from all sides at the same time. I'll leave it, at that level of generality, but it could lead to some conversation about questions having to do with trust in science, because what effectively Kuhn, who was no Foucault, he had a PhD in physics, he believed in science. What he was arguing was that there is a higher level of uncertainty about the way we know the world than we used to think. And so, you could say in the 19th century, you had the whole process during which a lot of people stopped believing that God was responsible for everything that moved in the universe, and there was a crisis around secularization. And in the 20th century, there was this crisis around the fact that even the secular point of view was subject now to human limitation, and that people who even work in laboratories will see the world differently depending on where they are, what their paradigm is, and how they understand the world, which is again something that changes over time. So, I see that as being part of modern history, and to some extent, the issues that are being debated today aren't so much about the fact that there's one truth. It's about the level of emphasis you put on questions around race, or questions around any other kind of marker of identity. And I think what you find when you have again, to go back to Jonathan Haidt, what you have when you have these different bubbles is that when you're within a particular bubble of thought, and maybe you could even call it a paradigm, you think there's just this one set of things, and you see it everywhere. But whatever it is that causes it, it gets reinforced constantly by this sense that you can only really trust this little group of people with whom you agree. And that's beginning to spill out and spill over into just about everything else, whether it has to do with just, the way, scientists come out and say things about a virus that might appear as a novel feature of and very consequential feature of our world, or a vaccine, or a set of recommendations around public health, as obviously I'm talking about the pandemic.
Yeah.
But it's becoming, I think, the case that if everybody has their own truth, then why should we listen to the so-called experts? Because they're not always right. and they change their minds a lot, and they seem to, disagree with each other.
Mm-hmm. Well, so that's, I think, an interesting maybe segue. One of the things that so you mentioned social media, and I know Jonathan Haidt's really focused on that, and I do think that's a really big piece of it. Cable news, certainly still, but preceding social media being a big piece of that as well. I also contend that, at least in some small part, and if anybody wants to fund a research study, I would love it, but I don't have those resources to figure this out. But my hypothesis is something like this, that in 1983, we had A Nation at Risk, which was published. It basically said our public schools are way behind and struggling compared to China, Russia, you name it, all of the big names, and we really better get our butts in gear. And that put us on a multi-decade since then sort of path and trajectory in public school education and probably private school as well, that was more focused on answers and accountability. I call it a culture of achievement. That sounds, who doesn't want achievement, but the incentivization of that kind of a classroom, that I've seen extreme examples of it where, kids are tested every 2 weeks, teachers' scores are compared, administrators are hovering over those ones who are half a percentage lower, and, really just super, super focused on those outcomes, those numbers, those metrics, as opposed to more of a culture of teaching and learning that might be more inquiry embedded, more Socratic, might have, at least it was prior to the A Nation at Risk and sort of the shift, it was easier for teachers who had that disposition and wanted to run their classrooms in that way to do it. And it's harder to do it now because of the incentive structure. And so, at least in some small part, that has contributed to adults now that are not particularly good at or don't have the dispositions of somebody who might seek out those different opinions, look to confirm or disconfirm their beliefs, be comfortable with the discomfort, and all of those kinds of things. Again, just a small piece of the puzzle. And one of the things that we're working on here, and a line of demarcation that I really try to make, we're building out a community that is meant to help K-12 stakeholders have some of these conversations and get into it. And it's really reliant heavily on the work of Jonathan Rauch. I love Kindly Inquisitors. I love Constitution of Knowledge. And so when you're talking about that, how do we figure out what is quote unquote true? You come to consensus through that sort of liberal science approach. And my argument to schools, if they're talking about neutrality, and again, that's not the term that we'd like to use, but that we really should insist on, and this applies to both, far left and far right, if you just look at it as a simple spectrum, of where are you being illiberal? Where are you not applying liberal science? Where are you not looking for what we're calling for objective pluralism, really looking for a variety of ideas and viewpoints and the complexity, and not necessarily pushing, because we do see some activists in schools. We do see, the California ethnic studies that sort of marginalized Martin Luther King Jr. and some of the early drafts and said, that wasn't good, and we've got to be more aggressive, and basically saying we should be the only seat at the table, not one of the seats at the table. So I just threw a lot at you. I'm curious, any sort of reflections on any of that.
Yeah, I confess at the outset that I'm not someone who's worked deeply in K through 12
right.
Educational worlds, but I certainly have followed some of the literature and some of the practitioners who have advocated for things like project-based learning, for not only trying to recenter the student as the real subject of learning, but also to think about the process whereby one can learn and what it is that one is trying to teach. And thinking more about the process than about the outcome. And so everything you said, in terms of thinking about achievement at the level of certain kinds of objective measures or so-called objective measures, and basically educating for tests. strikes me as probably part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And I totally agree with the with those who argue that what students need to learn in the first place is how to learn, and they learn how to learn by getting excited about a project, learning how to do research on it, learning how to assess the different kinds of sources that are out there, and understand something about what level of authority you can accord to them, but also seeing that there are different kinds of perspectives. Once you start, wandering around and looking somewhat openly at, what the sources might be, and that that every project you engage in is about finding ways to have to make judgments, but judgments within a world in which there are lots of different kinds of directions you could go in or choices you could make, and that's the kind of way we learn, because that's the world that these students will enter, whether you think about college or whether you think about life, and indeed both. Because it's not being handed to you anymore, as a set of things that you're going to be tested on, and that's the world that you have to worry about. Because in fact, it's a much more complex situation. So, what you say sounds to me as not only plausible, but as a very important part of an argument for why one needs to think differently about inquiry-based teaching and learning in school. I think it's a complex question, as you said.
Sure.
This is one piece in a very big puzzle. But how do you instill a kind of tolerance for other points of view? Well, you first expose people to them, and then you realize, perhaps if you're working on a project with people who don't share your point of view, that not everybody sees it the same way. I mean, the best course I ever had in some sense in college was my freshman year, my first semester in college. I had a course on free will and necessity, is what they called it, which they really meant free will and determinism, I guess. And it was taught by two people. One was a philosopher, and the other was a psychologist. And the psychologist believed that we were kind of programmed by previous experience to think about the world in particular ways. The choices we made were choices that came out of previous things that we had experienced, and that we weren't really going to be able ever to think outside the box entirely. And the philosopher, thought about freedom and thought about, the individual self as having full agency and making decisions that were their own. They argued and argued and argued, but they argued from the point of view of great respect for each other. And it was just a kind of eye-opening experience to realize these two incredibly smart people had very different views. And had lots of different sources to back up their arguments, and ultimately didn't agree. But, in each case brought really interesting and important elements to the discussion. And that, is about ultimately really big questions around, what does it mean to be free in the world? What does it mean to make a decision? What is, what is free will all about in any case? So I think, I think education has such a critical role. And, the other thing I'll say is that, by the time students get to college, a lot of things are set. The world of K through 12 education is really ultimately what makes success possible in the college and university world. So it's critical that when we talk about these issues, we figure out ways to actually make them work within the K through 12 environment, because that is ultimately what is going to matter most for our lifetimes.
Yeah, and I think there's a few different sort of pieces of that puzzle. K-12, public school, the curriculum is pretty much set, by, I mean, it's set by the school boards, and it is set, by the government in I guess, ultimately. And there's not a lot necessarily that would be open for debate, right? There are social studies kinds of classes, history, I used to teach psychology, humanities, English, language arts, where you might see examples that students could debate and have really rich and a variety of viewpoints. But then, when you get to math, although, well, let me just say, so when you get to like something like math, like multiplication tables is not particularly something that we want to debate. The sphere of consensus is pretty small there, right? Or it's pretty narrow and focused. That being said, there are ways, and sort of the other part of the puzzle is sort of the intuitive ways that teachers talk and work and think, and what are the sort of implied messages and things that they sort of pass on. And that, I think, is another that's almost maybe a bigger bone of contention, because I argue, people say, critical race theory is taking over, has infected all of our K-12 schools. And so, I don't know that that's accurate. If you go to, Western Kentucky, for example, you're more likely to see a version of it. Or just recently, there was a problem, I think it was in Louisiana, where there was a high school girl that was dancing on a video, and it was a little risque, but not crazy. Having chaperoned a high school prom in my days, I've seen worse. But the principal, because he revoked her scholarship recommendations, removed her from student government, printed out Bible verses for her, and said he questioned her faith. Now, he's walked all of that back and apologized since. But, I say, well, you might see some sort of dynamics like that at play in certain geographic hotspots with something like critical race theory or gender kinds of things. But in other places, you'll see it with sort of fundamental Christian values and that kind of thing. And sort of the way that like, this is the water in which we swim. And so trying to really navigate that is, I think, a unique challenge of K-12, especially public school educators, and how they do that. And again, trying to really rely on the idea of liberal science and saying we have to allow for a variety of viewpoints and that sort of pluralism. But I'm curious, like, how you think about this. How do we really use the sort of sphere of consensus? Like, are all the viewpoints really what we want to be considering? I mean, do we want to be spending energy? How do we make that distinction of what is really sort of worth talking about, and things say, yeah, that's outside the sphere of consensus. We're not going to talk about that, because the inherent danger there is, of course, that there's ideas, especially in the university space, that might be outside of those spheres of consensus at one point, but like, actually the earth is not flat, or there are no such thing as witches, and it becomes actual consensus. So how do you recommend sort of navigating some of those way out sort of viewpoints that people would say, that's crazy, like, I don't have time for that?
Yeah, well, a really interesting question, because in a way, as I was thinking about our conversation, you could say, too much emphasis on just free inquiry could lead ultimately to, somebody believing that anything is, every point of view is equal.
Right.
And that, if it's my idea, I don't actually have to worry about the fact that an expert is coming to tell me that it, is wrong or limited or whatever it might be. Which
I think we see and actually happening these days.
Yeah, we do. We see a lot of it, and so how do you kind of use this word carefully? How do you balance, the desire to get everyone thinking for themselves, with the fact that there are areas of consensus that may not be consensus forever, as you said, but they're nevertheless consensus of the kind that might, for example, make it fundamental to being able to do algebra or geometry. I mean, there are certain things that are wrong, And so, we can talk a lot about the need for everyone to develop their own critical perspective, but we also, I think, have to develop some kind of respect for knowledge that that has been shown time and time again to have a higher claim, as it were, to truth than other kinds of points of view. And that, I think, is really part of the crisis too right now, because we alluded to it before, but if let's talk about some hot button issues. Let's talk about climate. There are lots of debates that climate scientists engage in, but there also are certain things that climate scientists agree about. And there's a difference between what is settled knowledge in science and what is not settled. Scientists tend to work on what is less settled, because that's where you can learn new things. But they all begin with, a set of understandings about physics or chemistry or biology or mathematics that have a lot of just sort of assumptions built into them that this is where you have to start, this is what you have to know, and if you mix this chemical with that chemical, it's going to explode in a test tube, and there are consequences to not accepting that might be
right
true. So then the question for us as educators becomes, how do you create a world, an educational world in which everyone is trying to figure these things out, but they're also are have to learn that there are greater and lesser levels of authority that are attached to particular kinds of forms of knowledge, right? And it's I think that's the challenge, because you don't want to say there's one truth and one way to approach this, but you want to use education to allow students to develop their own capacity to make those kinds of judgments, but to make judgments that ultimately accord them both a certain level of freedom and independence on the one side, but a certain respect for what is real established knowledge on the other. That's how science proceeds. But, it's complicated. For example, in the pandemic, one of the things we learned is what science is like in real time. Nobody had ever seen this virus before. So initially, of course, we all of us, certainly we were scrubbing our grocery bags.
Right, spraying
them. The house, we were spraying everything with isopropyl alcohol. We were, every surface was, and then all of a sudden the scientists said, it's not spread by surfaces, it's not fomites, it's aerosol based. Now you have to stay 6 feet apart and put masks on and so on. Well, a lot of people thought, well, why don't they know? I mean, what's going on here? And if they don't know, how can I trust them? If they change their minds so quickly, what does that say to us about the authoritative basis on which science proceeds, and the knowledge that it claims for itself? And it was a truly kind of destabilizing time for many people.
Still is.
And it still is. And even today, people, regardless of their political positions, are debating, did we do the right thing with the lockdown? Did we do the right thing around, about closing schools? What are the consequences of having had so much remote learning for, the recent ACT results and the like,
Right.
And there are clearly a lot of things that we just didn't know at the time, but that have not only created enormous political debate and sometimes even greater polarization, but also displayed the fact that science in real time is a messy affair. And so we need to, I think, try to make this into, pardon the expression, but a teachable moment, because it actually was, in some ways, not necessarily the response to the things we were learning, but the way we were learning things, a real kind of real world example of how science proceeds in the world.
Well, that brings us to that issue of trust in science, and as you said, we both agree, like it's still destabilizing. And one of the things that, like, I try to be a skeptic, right? We try to be skeptical. What is the trust but verify kind of thing, right? And we want our public health institutions and our scientific institutions, which is a monolith and made up of lots of individuals, and there's a level of complexity there too, but we want them to be truthful. We want them to be accurate. We want them to be have the reputation that we can take their advice. And I have seen evidence that makes me wonder about those things. Right, the ways in which they message things that they don't. Maybe I'm not sure if this is true, or like it doesn't seem to be true, and they continue with that messaging, or they sort of suppress different voices. I had Jay Bhattacharya on the podcast, quite some time ago. Folks might be familiar with him if you listen to that podcast, but Stanford professor, certainly a credible voice. He and some others issued the Great Barrington Declaration. There's evidence of Tony Fauci and Francis Collins having some interchange on email about having to, devastating takedown of these ideas, and sort of it looks like that there's potential for suppressing these ideas and pushing these back. And attached to all of this, of course, is a sense of tribalism, right? That so many people are like, well, this is my tribe, and I have to choose my hero and choose the villains, and that makes it really hard to sort of unpack and figure out. I think it makes it harder for those folks who engage in that, and I think we probably all do to some extent, to really navigate it, because it's hard to, like, I'm supposed to trust this person, and I'm supposed to hate this person or villainize this person. And it really has, unfortunately, in my perception, really eroded the public trust in public health institutions, science at large, right? The way we think about science and scientists and those kinds of things. So are there other dynamics that you see at play there, or how do you think about that trust factor and rebuilding that trust?
Yeah, so at the New York Academy of Sciences, we actually do a lot of work on this, and I think we're like everyone, struggling to find the best ways to do something that would actually begin to restore some kind of trust, at least on the part of some people for whom trust has become really a scarce commodity in this kind of context. I think. In the immediate aftermath of the pandemic, the call that one should just follow the science was an unfortunate way of putting it, a kind of infelicitous phrase, because the science
right.
keeps moving. It's a moving target, and so we try to stage conversations with people who are terrific scientists. Recently, for example, we had before the Nobel Prizes were announced, we had Catalin Carrico and Drew Weissman on one of our panels about the universal vaccine, about the work they're doing to create a universal vaccine, talking about what they were learning in the whole context of COVID. They both got the Nobel for medicine for their work on mRNA vaccines, and so they got in the news recently, including the fact that while Drew Weissman, has a standard academic success story of a personal history, Carrico was actually dismissed from Penn on multiple occasions, and she was the one who was coming up with these ideas about mRNA, which actually were critical for the ways in which then Drew's lab began to develop the mRNA idea. So So again, it's not like even institutions necessarily make good decisions about who are the people who are really kind of,
Right.
doing the creative work that we need to advance science. But I say that because this is a really interesting case of work that's been done over 20, 30 years, in which there's been a lot of changing ideas about how RNA is related to DNA, what it means to use effectively a synthetic kind of vaccine as opposed to the older vaccines that were all basically created in the body, that antibodies that involved actually a little bit of the disease, and then capping the lethality of the disease. That's where vaccines actually began with smallpox, for example, in the 19th century, when a little bit of smallpox was applied to a person, and so they had a minor smallpox infection when they were very healthy, and it created a scar on their arm, where they were given what is called this variolation.
I've got one.
Yeah.
I believe. No, that was probably measles, right?
That was measles, yeah. But
or maybe chickenpox. I don't even know. It's been so long. Yeah, sorry.
but this is how the old vaccine used to be given, and basically you develop your own immunity in a less dangerous situation with the actual disease, as opposed to mRNA, which is a synthetic, where it's not going to cause the disease. It's not the virus. So, but there was a process, and again, lots of debate, lots of disagreement, lots of change. So what we try to do is get people, in fact, excited about that process, and then if you get involved in it, you start chasing the truth, but you're chasing the truth by following it down, paths that sometimes aren't going to lead anywhere. You get a kind of better understanding of how science works, and then you have a higher tolerance for statements that are made that turn out not to be true, and you don't throw the baby out, as it were, with the bathwater. Now, not everybody's going to be a scientist, but I think everybody in schools who's taking science can learn through different kinds of experiments and different kinds of projects how that process works better than perhaps than just putting on the board what the scientific method is and assuming somehow if you answer what are the 5 elements of the scientific method, you're going to pass the test and that's the end of it. So anyway, I mean, how are we doing it? We're doing it in ways we know best. And I'd be very happy for any of your listeners and your podcast to share some of the materials that we've developed, even for schools, doing things like innovation challenges for young people.
Yeah, and that sounds like something we should talk about. Let me give you an example, and I'm just curious how you might navigate this or how you think about it. And it might be, I'll acknowledge up front, it might be that I'm very wrong on this, but as I understand it. So when we talk about the reputation of the science, right? CDC being one of those sort of monoliths, right? I see sort of continual messaging from the CDC that says, vaccines are available for 6 months and up. And if I'm understanding it correctly, which again, I might be wrong, if I'm understanding it correctly, there's almost no real reason or real risk to, kids and even into teenage years. You get up to 65 and up, and as you get older, and some other health issues that could cause, make you a higher risk profile and that kind of thing. But, to use a technical term, it seems kind of bonkers that we would have the idea that we're really pushing vaccination for little kids for a variety of reasons. And so then I think, well, I try to figure out, am I going to, because I have 2 daughters, 14 and 16, should I continue to get them boosted and all these kinds of things, right? And trying to come at that from a skeptical point of view and also say, well, I want to be wrong for a shorter amount of time as possible. So how can I sort of disprove what I think is actually true here? And, there's some seemingly credible scientists who would say, that is, they're probably not saying bonkers, but it's like there's no real need for kids to get vaccinated unless they have a unique health profile that puts them more at risk. And so when I hear that, and I think this is probably true of a lot of people, they hear the CDC saying these things, but then they hear other credible voices saying there's no real need for that. It sort of scrambles your brain because you think, well, I want to trust the CDC. They seem like we should trust them. But how do you navigate that? And I don't know that I'm not even assuming that you have an answer to that because it's such a complex problem, right? But it really strikes me as sort of a really great example of that sort of tension between the trust and maybe the bias or the communication, mass communication, and trying to communicate to a large number of people and not feeling like you can be more complex and add nuance to that messaging. So how do you think about those kinds of things?
Yeah, well, look, it's always the case, I think, that when you translate science into public policy, whether it's in public health or any number of other areas, you run the risk of raising that kind of question. What is the authoritative basis on which this is being recommended,
Mm-hmm.
and how am I going to deal with that? And how seriously do I take it? And if it's not actually completely true, or if there are a lot of credible voices that are saying it's they have different points of view on it, how the heck am I supposed to figure out what to do in the midst of all of this? And then you leap from that to say, well, everything that comes out of a public body of that kind is equally suspect.
Right.
Now that becomes a real issue when you're talking about, let's say, a vaccine for polio. Now I'm old enough that my older brothers were told sometimes not to go to when they were little, not taken to a public swimming pool because there was polio. And by the time I was born, the polio vaccine was available, and we all took it. And my mom used to say, how grateful she was for the polio vaccine because she could start taking us off to swimming pools, and and there were enough people that she knew who had childhood polio that had crippled them in some fundamental way that it was clear that was something that you had to be really frightened by.
Mm-hmm.
Now there's a difference between the typical case of a 14-year-old getting, or 16-year-old in your case, getting COVID, because usually it's a very light case and it's not that different from the flu, and they build up their immunity and so on and so forth. And the cases of long COVID don't typically exist for healthy kids. It's usually when you're older. But I guess, the whole problem is nobody really understands long COVID very well. There was a new study came out last week that said that long COVID is partly because the COVID virus will find its way into your gut, basically, and continue to cause havoc even when it's been excised from the respiratory system, where it does its primary work, and the symptoms around which are the ones that are primarily associated with COVID disease. So, again, as we know more about that, maybe we'll have better answers. But we don't at the moment, and you're right. It doesn't necessarily feel as critical now to think about taking everybody. I mean, I got my booster, but I'm in a demographic where that was strongly recommended, and that's different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm kind of getting there. So I'm 54, so I'm like, oh, I'm getting close-ish, right? Because 65 kind of being one of the recommended lines of like 65 and up, definitely get it kind of thing.
Well, Drew, you have a few years before you get I've crossed that Rubicon, but that being said, it's you're absolutely right, and the question is, if you overplay your hand, do you then jeopardize what might bring with it much greater consensus about the risk profile of a particular action, whether you take a shot or you don't? or whether you take a vaccine or you don't. So I guess I'm saying that I think one thing that we've learned from the experience of the last 3-4 years is that we may have to be much more modest about what we recommend, at the same time that we double down on the kinds of things that we really believe will cause serious risk for a population, whether it's in terms of a vaccine or whether it's in terms of, protecting our food supply or ensuring the safety of other kinds of drugs. And of course, on the one hand, there's, the vaccine, which is there to protect against a disease. On the other hand, there are pharmaceutical products that have caused side effects that are occasionally devastating for an individual, which which is why we accorded such power as we did to the FDA around things like thalidomide and the like. So again, it's every one of these issues is enormously fraught. Everyone is complex, but I don't think we've gotten to a point where we've fully taken on board all of the lessons of the pandemic, and I hope that we can have a slightly, and this to your initial set of questions to me, get to the point where you can have a slightly more open conversation about all of this. So it's not about, this is my side or that's your side, but that, there are actually things we might change our minds about.
Yeah, well, I was going to quibble with one of your assertions until you just said, we still have some work to do to take on some of these lessons learned, because it seems clear to me that there are certainly some parties who have acknowledged and say, well, we've got some work to do here, and then some that don't seem to, and that makes it more difficult. But then the us versus them mind virus, as I kind of talk about it, makes it almost impossible with some people to be able to sort of acknowledge maybe being wrong about something, or just the skepticism comes from a place of orthodoxy and dogmatism and tribalism that is just doesn't allow them to process it, and that's a really dangerous thing. And just thinking about how we help students K-12 and then university really recognize that dynamic, that us versus them, Jonathan Haidt and Greg Luciano's book Coddling of the American Mind, talking about one of those great untruths of the world as a place of good and evil people, or some version of that. So that's one of those things I think we really have a sort of moral imperative to work on in our education, K-12 and higher ed. You mentioned some of the materials. I'd like to hear, and like our listeners to hear a little bit about some of those materials that you have for, I'm assuming, K-12 educators to engage with.
Yeah, thank you, Drew. We have something called the Junior Academy, and young people primarily between the ages of 13 and 18, although we have other programs for students in earlier years as well. But in the Junior Academy, students participate in what we call innovation challenges, and we set a kind of a project, a problem, an issue. It could have to do with a question around how you recycle a particular kind of plastic that's been causing problems in the oceans. It could be around figuring out some puzzle having to do with new data we're getting from the Webb telescope. It could be around some issue around new materials and chemistry and physics, whatever. But it's a question that always has a real world bearing, and so, like the recycling one. How do you break down certain kinds of plastics? How do you create and then we get these kids together. They form teams. This is done online, so they can do this from anywhere. And usually there are eight kids on a team, and then we assign to the team a mentor who's a senior scientist. I mean, a senior scientist in the sense of a PhD scientist who works with them. and they work on these, and it's a bit of a competition. So we do have judges at the end, and we give awards and other things to recognize the work of the teams. But the kids who participate love it, and oftentimes these are the kinds of extracurricular projects that get them really excited about going to chemistry class or biology class or physics in high school, and often they begin to see the possibility of even becoming a scientist when they see how much fun it is to do, because science is hard. So there's a lot that can discourage a student. And I'll give an example of an individual who was a first generation college student, but he was grew up in Queens, outside in New York, and nobody in his family had gone to college, but he was going to a school in Manhattan, and he got involved in the junior academy years ago, and he did a project with some teammates that was called Regeneration, and it was about finding ways for body parts to regenerate. Anyway, he just got really excited by that work. He went on to college, graduate school, created a company with a friend of his. The company's called Regeneron. And it's now one of the major new pharmaceutical companies working solely on using biological immunity and antibodies to fight things like cancer and the like. A lot of the new therapies that are coming out for cancer are coming out of firms like this. And they created the monoclonal antibody to treat the first generation of COVID. And you might recall then President Trump talking about how great Regeneron was when he got over COVID.
I thought that sounded familiar.
Yeah. But the point is that this is an individual who did one of our programs and got excited by it, and then has had a brilliant career. I'm not saying it's the only thing that helped him along his way, but it certainly was something that got him really excited. And to go from Regeneration to Regeneron is a nice way to put it, because it shows you the real connection. So again, the Junior Academy at the New York Academy of Sciences. Just check out our website. We'd love to provide teachers with materials that we use. We have different kinds of webinars for teachers. Sometimes we have programs in the greater New York area where we send a scientist to a school and in the after school period, just to give them, again, a kind of in-person example of this kind of mentorship. And, to see a scientist, to spend some time with somebody doing active research is sometimes very exciting for young people. So those are just some of the programs we do, but we'd be very excited to work with any of your listeners out there.
Yeah, and the website is nyas.org, and I'm looking, the Junior Academy seems to be under the heading of community. It looks like you've just got a ton of things on this website, so you could navigate around for hours probably, but if you go to the community tab, and it looks like the Junior Academy's there. You've also got under programs some things like professional development, so that might be of interest to folks as well. So nyas.org, and of course we'll put that in the show notes. Anything else that you want to mention that you haven't mentioned, and any other links or anything like that? And also, I'm curious, because you're not in your home office there, but you've got a lot of books behind you. What have you read recently that has been really interesting, if anything?
Oh my! Well, there you are. You put me on the spot by asking what I've read recently. But I've been reading some things in the history of science and enjoying a variety of different things. I mentioned Thomas Kuhn before. I was reading about him. There was a wonderful book I read very recently by Andrea Wolff called The Invention of Nature, which is really about the great explorer Alexander von Humboldt in the 19th century. And he was one of the inspirations, in fact, for the development of the New York Academy. I read a lot of different things, but I do have a full-time management job, so I also spend a lot of my time reading memos and the like. But also just wrote, and I'll try to send this to you for a link. Also just wrote a recent op-ed about restoring trust in science, and even was in touch with the New York Times and sent a letter in that got published on Monday about an article written by somebody there about the loss of trust in scientific institutions. So maybe I can send you in a few links and maybe some highlights of books that I would recommend. But
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, nothing I'd add except to say that, I've enjoyed this conversation a lot. It's been we've covered a lot of different kinds of material, but I really appreciate your openness to making sure different kinds of views get fed into the way we think about our responsibility as educators. It's just so critical today. I think a lot hangs on our success in finding new ways to really ensure that that new generations become a little bit more tolerant than we've been showing ourselves to be of late about different points of view.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, and it is certainly something, like I said, everything that we do is sort of through the lens of inquiry, and we do a lot of project-based learning work, differentiation, lots of different things, but we are also trying to sort of expand that footprint and try to help K-12 education stakeholders in space really better understand, at least how I think about, sort of this line of demarcation between illiberalism and sort of application of liberal science, some of those dynamics at play, and how we can really foster that. And I think inquiry and curiosity is a central piece of that. So that's a whole other hour conversation that I'm always happy to have, but we won't do it here. So, Nick, I really appreciate the time.
Thank you, Drew.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.